Moses was like, I don't want to lead. And God says, oh yeah, you're leading. And he's like, no, I don't want to lead. Please have somebody else lead. And he says, no, you're going to lead. And he's like, see, I'm leading, and it's horrible, and I told you it would be.
Our passage this week is from Numbers 11, 1 through 35. The Israelites have just started on a trek from Sinai to the Promised Land, and we are given a glimpse into their hearts. Seeing their hearts gives us an opportunity to examine our own hearts as we consider right responses to our God.
Numbers chapter 11. Complaining is a tough topic. There is a balance, probably, that we need to find. What is a complaint? What is not a complaint? Is it okay to complain sometimes? Is it bad always to complain? I remember, many of you probably didn't know this, but several years ago now we had our phone system at the church was not working well, and we were under contract, and they would not respond to our pleas and calls for help. And so I started calling the contact every day. And every day I'd call them and say, we still do not have a solution. Could you please call me back? We need to get this fixed. And I did that for maybe 3 months. I'm sure I missed a few days here and there. Nothing. Complaint after complaint after complaint. No response. Was I right? Was I wrong? Maybe I should have done more. Maybe we should have sued him. I don't know. I read about a man who got arrested on suspicion of fraudulent obstruction of business after making over 24,000 complaint calls to his local phone company. He was angry with his telephone service provider for a variety of reasons, including the fact that he was unable to receive radio signals on his telephone. And police said that he initially demanded an apology in person from company staffers, but later began immediately terminating the calls as soon as they were placed, and he would make an average of 33 calls per day. In one particular week, he made over 400 calls. He was lodging a complaint. Is that okay? Is that too much? Where do you draw the line? I read about another time a guy out west, out in Montana, was driving along a dirt road. His dog was riding in the back of the pickup. He had a trailer, a horse trailer behind that, and he did not negotiate a curve well, and he caused a terrible accident. And a highway patrolman came upon the scene, and he saw the horse first, and he was an animal lover, and he saw the serious nature of the injuries, and he drew his service revolver, and he put the animal out of its misery. And then he walked around the accident, and there was the dog that was also hurt critically, and he couldn't bear to hear it whine in pain, and so he ended the dog's suffering. You can see where this is going. He came around to the man who was suffering from multiple fractures, and he said, "Hey, are you okay?" He said, "I've never felt better." Combating complaining. When is it okay to complain? When is it not okay to complain? When we come to Numbers chapter 11, we see what might be a surprising story unless we kind of view it, I think, within its full context and understand the message that is being given to us. Maybe we would look at what God is doing with the Israelites and feel like it was not justified. Can I just encourage you? Everything that God does is justified. Now, we might not understand all of the aspects, but if we approach the passage from that standpoint, I would suggest that is indeed the right standpoint from which to approach the passage. But as we then dig into this passage, we learn a lot about God, we learn a lot about ourselves, we learn a lot about the Israelites. And in the midst of that, we are given, I think, some great wisdom with regards to complaining. And so I decided to put it into this form here for us this morning. 3 questions that we should ask when we find ourselves complaining. 3 questions that we should ask when we find ourselves complaining. And we're going to see these If you're hastily writing these down, I will give you a moment to do that, but we will see them all. We're going to go through them all. So here is the first one. What is your complaint revealing in the midst of difficulty? Check your heart. The reality is that when we come across difficulties, travail, there is a revelation that can happen when we come across trials, difficulties, travails. We are given a picture, a window into who I really am. The Israelites were really doing nothing more than revealing their own character. And in this story, the people's complaints start as soon as they depart for the promised land. So let's just think about the context. Chapter number 1, all the way through chapter number 10 of Numbers, has been preparation for the journey. And rather than in chapter number 11, rather than immediately saying, and they started walking, it says, and the people complained. So it's just an interesting way to tell the story. That rather even saying that this was like the beginning of the journey, they just immediately launches into this concept that the people were complaining. Now we know that there is a particular place that this occurred because, like I said when I read the passage, verse number 1 to verse number 3 is really talking about the first incident. And in that first incident, God responds in a very merciful way, but it would have happened along the journey. And in the midst of that journey, this occurred, and then it continued to happen. What it's doing is it's giving us a series of stories in which every group among the Israelites rebel against God's provisions and God's plans. This complaint, this rebellion, are, I think, if we're just reading along, it's an unforeseen response to the very careful revelation of the structure of the camp, the arrangement of the camp, the construction of the camp. I mean, that's what we've been learning about all the way in Numbers. It's like, here is the center of the camp. Here's how it's put together. Here's what this person does and this person does. And here how God is going to go in the midst of them. And it's like Moses even ends it with talking to Hobab about how it's going to be awesome and you ought to come along and then complain. And it's kind of like an unforeseen thing. And I would suggest that that's on purpose. That it's intended for us to feel a little bit of a shock, for it to catch us unaware, for it to be like, whoa, why are they complaining so much? What happened? And I would suggest that is how we are supposed to feel because that is how God felt. That ultimately God did all of these things and then the Israelites were unsatisfied. And then as we look at these first 3 complaint stories, I mentioned 2 of them here in Numbers 11, one that we'll get to next week in Numbers 12. And they are given to us in a series that is not probably relative to their journey. In other words, it's not like the story is not like they started here and then they went here and this happened and then here and this happened and then here was a complaining time. It's given to us all in the series. And it's like here are 3 instances of complaints. Here are 3 things that happened. And it's like, why did they tell it that way? Maybe in our Western mind, we would view it differently. But you're telling it that way in order to really draw out the significance of it. When you repeat something 3 times, it tends to bring out the emphasis. And I would suggest that that's exactly what's happening here, is that these 3 stories, out of many, are pulled out to bring forward to us this concept of this was their character. Because the difficulty was revealing who they were. Sadly, in my own life, I can see this as well. And potentially you can in your life as well. You know, my complaints help me to understand where I'm looking for contentment. And I would suggest yours will as well. If I'm content, I won't complain. If I'm discontent, then complaining ensues. Because I'm not happy with the way the things are, right? And sadly, and you've probably discovered this in your own life, my contentment is a moving target. Once I find contentment in something, then I start to grow discontent with that. It's not as if it's like, oh, I really enjoy that, and so now I will forever be content with that. That grows tiresome and weary for me. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you experienced that? And so my contentment becomes a moving target as well. In a certain sense, my contentment has an appetite, and it always wants to eat. Knowing this, I should use difficulties in order to check my heart. Difficulties, travail, reveals who I am. It also reveals who God is. You know, God does not always respond in a way that we think he might. We could all say a hearty amen to that, right? God does not always respond in the way that we think he might. And we know that that is because he is God. And he is different than us. He thinks different than us. That does not mean that he does not respond. A passage that came to mind as I was working through this passage, Judges chapter 7, verse 2. The Lord said to Gideon, the people which with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Just an example of God thinking about things differently than we would. Gideon is gathering people to go up against a much larger force, and God says it's way too many, right? It's way too many. We need to lower this down. And we don't think that way. That's not how we think. And all of the difficulties that we come across, they tend to reveal how God is going to respond in a way that we are not accustomed to. And we're going to see that brought out in this passage as well. So difficulties reveal us, they reveal God, but they also reward us. They reward proper responses from that standpoint. What they do is they demonstrate things like the character of God and his never failing nature. You know, the truth is that God actually never fails. There is never a situation that takes place in your life that you think he is going to fail, or you worry that he will fail, that will ultimately be a failure. You say, okay, but let's define failure. And it's like, yeah, you're right. That's exactly the point. Because we're reminded of Romans chapter 8, verse 26 to 28. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. And I included this part before we get to verse 28, right? Because it's helpful for us to see this in its context. The Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what to pray for as we ought. Man, we could say an amen to that too, couldn't we? Especially in the midst of difficulty. Especially in the midst of travail. It's like I don't always know how I am supposed to pray. Thankfully, the Holy Spirit prays with us, himself interceding for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purposes. And so then our tension comes in when we say, okay, I understand that all things work together for good, but all things do not work together in the way that I want. And therefore it doesn't feel like it's good. And we go back to the end part of verse number 27, the Spirit interceding for the saints according to the will of God. Because ultimately that is what we want in our best moments. Not just our will, we want God's will. And that then drives forward now I lost it. Oh, there we go. That drives forward the verse that we are very familiar with, because God will turn it into good. So what travail does is it gives us a reward. Always. Always. Because in the midst of that, we are able to see God's goodness in our lives. There is never going to be a time where that isn't true. There will be times when we think it's not true. But God will redeem that. And that is a huge comfort to us. God also uses these difficult things to change us. And that is also a blessing. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And that steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. God is so gracious to us that he takes these difficulties and he uses them to refine us and shape us. We could look at other passages. One of them would be 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 and 7. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it's tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so God uses these difficult things to actually adjust and change us. And what an amazing thing that truly is. These difficulties do reward us. Now, when we think about what this looks like for the Israelites, we have this amazing opportunity that ultimately God is going to use in amazing ways. But it comes out in a way that is very painful for them and in a way that we look at and shake our heads because it's difficult on some level to understand why they respond the way that they do, but it's also very understanding. If we go back to our question that we're examining, what is your complaint revealing? If I'm in the middle of complaining, I ought to pause and I ought to check my heart. I ought to look at my complaint and I say, what is this saying about me? What is this saying about what I am looking at? Sometimes there still might need to be a reason to push forward with that. At other times, it may simply reveal that my focus is wrong. That's the first question. What is your complaint revealing? Here's the second question that we ought to ask. How is your complaint lying? In the midst of difficulty, not only should we check our heart, but we should also consider the truth. Complaints are a cancer. Look at Numbers chapter 11, verse number 1. It says, and the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Complaints are a cancer. There is a reality to complaints. In other words, we could look at it this way. The people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. Were they experiencing misfortune? Yeah, in a certain way, right? There were different things that they were experiencing where it was true that they had something about which to complain. So did they speak the truth, or at least a version of the truth? And that, of course, is part of the struggle. That's part of the tension, because it's like, but my complaint is real. But we would look at what the Israelites were complaining about and go, was it real? And the answer is, yeah, they had misfortune. This is what the verse is saying. It says they were complaining about their misfortune. It's kind of amusing that it says complaining in the hearing of the Lord. Where exactly were they that God heard? And the answer would be, well, everywhere. It's not like they only complained when they went by the tent of meeting. That God heard what they were saying, right? And that caused his anger to kindle. So what did he do? Well, in this scenario, he showed mercy by pouring out his wrath through fire on the outside of the camp. We're going to revisit that in a moment. The point that I want to draw out is that this then took off, that the people started with this complaining, and even though God responded to it, this complaining continued. It continued to grow. Look at verse number 4, the second incident. Numbers 11:4. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. Man, that's an interesting verse, isn't it? The rabble among them. You say, is that a pejorative? Was God taking a shot at the kind of people who were complaining? Who was this rabble? Some translations might even use the word riffraff. The riffraff that was among them had a strong craving. What is it talking about? I would suggest that it isn't intended to be a negative. It's not derogatory. It's not intended to be that. Rather, what it's talking about, this was a mixed multitude. And what we mean by a mixed multitude is not just unbeliever-believer. I'm talking instead about Israelite and non-Israelite. And so the rabble are the people that attach themselves to the Israelites. They're the rabble. They're the riffraff. They're people that ultimately joined the group when they left Egypt. And these people started the complaining. Verse 4, now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. But notice, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. And so this can't just be put at their feet. They started it, but the Israelites joined in. And so the complaining continued again. This all points out this concept of complaints being a cancer. Now, we all know what this is like. Have you ever been in a situation where you have somebody that you know, maybe you are that person, that just can't stop saying the negative things? And it could be that if you confront them about it, they say, yeah, but it's true. And the negative thing is true. And so they're constantly just bringing up the negative thing again and again and again. And the complaints continue. And then pretty soon you have this culture of complaint. You know what I'm talking about? And you've probably been in those situations. That can happen in a lot of different ways. That can happen within a church family. That can happen within a workplace. That can happen within a natural family. That can happen within a friend group. That can happen in all kinds of ways. Where you have these complaints that turn into a cancer. And it's important for us to recognize that if we are involved in complaining, we should pull back and ask that question, how is my complaint a lie? Or maybe, is my complaint a lie? Because complaints love to ignore truth. Complaints might say something that is true, but they do not say many things that are also true. They do not bring attention to all of the good. Hey, we can pause a moment and consider all of the good that God had done for the nation of Israel. And you say, okay, but yeah, he did all that good, but there was also these misfortunes. This was some hard stuff, and it was true what they were saying. But the whole point of this is that they were ignoring all of the good in order to focus upon that which is bad. And so remember all of the good that God has done. When I'm in the midst of complaining myself, I ought to pause and I ought to consider the truth. Is what I'm saying true, and is it enough of the truth? Am I actually sharing all of the good things as well? You say, well, then I will never stop talking. Okay, I'm not trying to say that you should say everything that could be said. But there ought to be a balance, shouldn't there be? That there ought to be a willingness to be honest about the situation. And so for the Israelites to say, hey, this is hard, but let's remember what God is doing, is different than saying, this is hard, this is terrible, this is horrible. I wish that it were different. And friends, in the midst of complaining, we ought to be asking ourselves that question. Am I willing to actually speak the full truth about this? Have you ever had a conversation with someone who did nothing but complain? They could not see the good that there was in life. Even when you would bring up good, their response was to debate whether it was good or not, and to quickly point you back to the bad. Hey, maybe you have a tendency for that in your own life, where it's like, yeah, but I see the bad so clearly that it's hard for me to see the good. And it's like, that's fine, but you have to recognize that that's there, and you have to be willing to actually speak the truth. Because ultimately, when all we do is focus upon the bad and are unwilling to address the good, we are actually saying something about God that is not true. And you say, man, that's kind of harsh. And I would say, I think that's exactly what the passage is pointing out. That ultimately the Israelites were making a complaint against God that he was not good. You say, well, we didn't necessarily say he wasn't good. It's just that all the things that he did for us were bad. And it's like, all the things? Well, not all the things, but you know what I mean. And it's like, that's exactly the point. That's the problem. And so when I'm in the midst of complaining, I need to check myself. Because complaints ignore truth, but they also shade the truth. Again, let's look at verse number 4 through 6. It says, now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions and the garlic. But now our strength has dried up and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at." Man, was all of this true? Okay, we remember the fish we ate in Egypt. Was there a lot of fish in Egypt? Yeah. What did it cost them? Slavery. Remember how you were beaten? You remember that? Man, that fish, that was free. That was absolutely free. Wasn't that wonderful? That was absolutely free. No, it wasn't free. That had a very high price. There is nothing at all but this manna to look at. You know, the manna was pretty amazing, wasn't it? I mean, the manna really was amazing. The description, it goes on to describe the manna. Let's look at that passage. Now, the manna, because this is why they're describing it, is because the complaint is the manna. Man, manna's kind of bad, right? That's all we got anymore. But what they're doing is they're shading the truth. Now, the manna was like coriander seed, its appearance like that of bdellium. What is that? Well, the point is, without trying to get into all of the, man, I think it was this, and this scholar says this, and that scholar, the whole point of it is that it actually caught the eye. It did not look bad. It had a good appearance. Verse 8, the people went about and gathered it and ground it in hand mills or beat it in mortars and boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. So in other words, they had a lot of different ways to eat the manna. So God provided this. It looked good, and they could make it in a variety of different ways. And the next part, the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. And if you get into the Hebrew of it, it does appear to be trying to point out the concept of this was delightful, that it tasted good as well. And so it's really combating this whole notion that, man, we have nothing but this manna to look at as if it is horrible. And then verse 9, when the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it. On top of it all, this stuff was miraculous. And God provided it every single night. I mean, it's truly amazing. And so in the midst of, as I had talked about before, in the midst of that first night when they were given manna, were they content? What do you think? 100%. And then their appetite changed. And their contentment shifted. Until now, they're like, man, all we have to eat is manna. How come God doesn't love us anymore? And what they're doing is they're shading the truth. And friends, this is so easy for us to do. You honestly, if you're ever in a position where you are talking with somebody that you want to drive home a point, sometimes we overstate what we're trying to say. We often call that hyperbole, right? And we speak in hyperbole in order to drive home our point. But sometimes all we do in our self-talk is we talk in hyperbole. This is really, really good, or this is really, really bad. And the problem is that when it shifts to my regular voice in my head, when it shifts to the normal way that I talk to everybody else, then it becomes something where I'm not actually dealing in truth. Please hear me. Because this is so prevalent. Because then this person always does this. And that's not true. And then I am constantly mistreated in this way. And that isn't true. And what we have done is we have now created a false reality. And then we're trying to make other people live within that false reality. And ultimately, it is completely dishonest. And in the midst of that all, then we'll lift up our eyes and we'll say, God, why did you let this happen? And appropriately, he should look down and say to us, you're not even telling the truth about it all. And that isn't what they were doing. They weren't telling the truth about what was actually happening. And the complaints were driving this. And so when we consider this in our own lives, it's important to ask that question. That question that kind of turns that view inward and kind of assumes something about my complaints. How is my complaint lying? Boy, I think that is a powerful thing to ask because it drives that question back to what I am failing to reveal. And you say, no, Pastor Steve, that's because you're a glass half full kind of guy. And so you're always trying to find the optimism. And I would say the only reason, you're going to debate this maybe, the only reason I'm a glass half full kind of guy is because I'm a Christian. Because God has solved everything. And because he has changed it all. And because Romans chapter 8, verse 28 is in Scripture. He will work all things out for good. All things. And so you say, well, it's easier for you because your personality is bent that way. And I say, hey, give me the win. I get one. That's great. Right? That one's easier for me. I have a lot of things that are harder for me. That one is easier for me. It's easier for me to do that. And if you struggle with that, okay, recognize the struggle and do the battle. Because that complaint that is there is nothing that God desires to have in your life. So what do we do with Moses? Because didn't Moses come to the Lord? Didn't he have a complaint to the Lord? And I would simply put it this way, where is your complaint looking? And so in the midst of difficulty, come to the Savior. Laments are different than complaints. Is there room for any negativity? Are we supposed to never say anything negative? Are you trying to put me in a box, Pastor Steve, where I can't ever say anything negative? And I would say, no, I'm actually not. I'm sure it feels that way right now. How can we talk about difficulties in the right way? I believe we see Moses doing this part very well in this instance. Because complaints are often shared with others who can't do anything about it. They don't always go to the source, and therefore they cannot be genuinely resolved. In fact, when Moses is going around the camp, he is hearing these complaints. These people are not necessarily going to him. It's just this constant refrain. It talks about how God heard their complaints, right? And Moses is supposed to deal with all of this. And honestly, for Moses, it'd be very easy to get pretty bitter about this because this is what he was afraid would happen. Have you ever been in that situation where you say, I told them this was going to occur, and then it did, then it is, and now I'm dealing with it. And it's like, that's Moses. Because Moses was like, I don't want to lead. And God says, oh yeah, you're leading. And he's like, no, I don't want to lead. Please have somebody else lead. He says, no, you're going to lead. And he's like, see, I'm leading, and it's horrible, and I told you it would be. And now I'm ticked. It's like, man, how many of us have had that conversation with God? It's like, Lord, look what you did, and I told you, did I not say? And it's like, this is like Jonah, right? It's like, look, Lord, what you did, I told you this would happen. But here's Moses coming to the Lord, and he is laying it out for him. Look at verse number 11 through 15. Moses said to the Lord, why have you dealt ill with your servant? Why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? He gets a little snarky with God. Did I give them birth that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing child? And he's mad. It's amazing to hear this, isn't it? Where is Moses having this conversation with God? In the tent of meeting. Before the Shekinah glory. The Shekinah glory that came out of the cloud with fire to consume those two priests. Remember that? And Moses is just going after him. To the land that you swore to give to their fathers. Where am I to get meat to give all these people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden's too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once. And there we get a little picture, right? Because Moses is like, hey, if you're going to consume me with fire, maybe that's better anyway. Do what you got to do. That I may not see my wretchedness. He is fed up. He's had enough. But I think the redeeming quality in all of this is that Moses actually comes to God. And he lays these things before him. That this is properly a lament. And friends, I would like to point out something that is amazing about God, that for all of his ferociousness, for all of his power, for all of his scariness, he is also loving. And Moses is willing to come and lay these things out before God, and God is willing to respond to him in the midst of that mercy. And you say, but will he always respond to us in the midst of that mercy? And that's the fearful part of God, right? Because it's like, I don't know if I should do that. But I would just encourage you that he actually loves you because you are his child if you're a believer. And he will treat you that way. And you say, but I don't deserve that, or I might not respond rightly. And I would say, but he loves you with an unshakable love. And so how does God respond to Moses? God responded in a way that we might not have expected. Verse 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel. This is a different 70, whom you know to be elders of the people, and officers over them, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you. It's super interesting. He doesn't say make sure they're this quality or that quality. He rather says gather ones that you know are in that position of authority, that people view them that way. And then what is he going to do? I will come down and talk with you there. I will take some of the spirit that is on you and put it on them. Because what is it that actually makes somebody good? It's the Spirit of God. And so it's a beautiful picture. This wasn't about pick out the very best people because, man, they got to be good enough. It's like I will actually make them good. I will actually do that work. God was doing that work in Moses. He is going to do that work in them. And they shall bear the burden of the people so that you may not bear it yourself alone. This reminds me of a story I read about Corrie ten Boom. Corrie ten Boom kept in a Nazi concentration camp. And the barracks where Corrie ten Boom and her sister Betsy were kept in that concentration camp, Ravensbrück. They were terribly overcrowded, and they were flea infested. And they had been able to miraculously smuggle a Bible into the camp. And in that Bible, they had read that they were to give thanks in all things, and that God can use anything for good. And Betsy, which if you know those stories with Corrie ten Boom, Betsy was, whether she was lifting Betsy up or not, Betsy stood as just this model of faith to Corrie ten Boom. And Betsy decided that this meant thanking God for what? The fleas. And that was too much for Corrie, who said she could do no such thing. But Betsy insisted, and so Corrie gave in and prayed to God and thanked him for even the fleas. And over the next several months, a wonderful but curious thing happened. They found that the guards never entered their barracks, and this meant that the women were not assaulted. It also meant they were able to do the unthinkable in Ravensbrück, which was to hold open Bible studies and prayer meetings in the heart of a Nazi concentration camp. Isn't that crazy? That's just amazing. And through this, countless numbers of women came to faith in Christ. And only in the end did they discover that the guards had left them alone because the fleas. And it's like, man, God works in amazing ways. And so here, God pours out his grace upon Moses by ultimately taking part of his spirit and putting it upon other leaders. And he did pour out his grace upon the Israelites because we find him in verse number 18 through 20 telling them he's going to give them meat. And he said to the people, consecrate yourself for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat, for you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us this meat? For it's better for us in Egypt. There was the lie, the shading of the truth. Therefore, the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall not eat just 1 day or 2 days or 5 days or 10 days or 20 days, but a whole month until it comes out your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. Because you've rejected the Lord who is among you, have wept before him, saying, why did we come out of Egypt? Would it have been okay if God had simply said, manna is enough? Yeah, that would have been okay. If God had said, you got manna, I think you're okay. Stop complaining. That would have been all right. That could have been God's response. But we see his heart. He will give them that for which they crave. It's interesting to me that God often does this. God often gives us that which we desire. And in the midst of that desire, we find out that what we wanted is really not that great for us. That's exactly what happens for them here. Because ultimately they gorged themselves on this, and they brought them to a point where ultimately it was not good for them. Let me point it out this way. A person is better than a solution, because we can take note of the progression. The complaining brought God's response immediately in the first incident, verse 1 through 3. Verses 4 through 35 represents a progression. They still did not trust the person. They wanted the situation to change. Rather than putting their contentment in a person, they put their contentment in a situation. They said, unless the situation changes, we will not be content. And so God changed the situation for them, and they still were not content. He gave them the meat, and they still could find no contentment. They were looking for solutions, which revealed their heart. They demonstrated that they were where they were putting their hope. Their hope was in their solution, their comfort, their answers. And so what did the Lord do? He brought up a wind. We can see the passage. He brought up a wind, and it brought quail from the sea. If you do the study, you will see that this is not abnormal, that there's a migration of quail that will happen across the desert. And so did God do that miraculously or providentially? The number of quail appears to be fairly providential. The point that we find in verse number 32 is that this was a lot of quail. Verse 32, the people rose all that day, all night, all the next day, and gathered the quail. Those who gathered least gathered 10 homers. 10 homers. What is that? Roughly 60 bushels. 60 bushels per person. That's enough to fill a pair of 55-gallon drums, if we can put it in perspective. So stick two 55-gallon drums. One person gathered enough quail to fill that. That's a lot of quail. And then they spread them out for themselves all over the camp. What's that? Probably a drying process that they attempted to do. And while the meat was yet between their teeth before it was consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck down the people with a very great plague. Now, I think it's very tempting to read that they didn't eat any quail that while it was still in their teeth, in the sense of they were just starting to put it in and God struck them. So they didn't even get the quail. They complained, God gave them the quail, they started to eat it, and then he killed them all. And I would say I don't think that's what it's actually pointing out. That what it's talking about is that they continued to gorge themselves over a period of time. Remember, the day, the 2 days, the week, the month, I'm going to give you lots of quail. And then in the midst of all of that, they continued to put their hope in the solution and not in God. Because notice what we are missing in all of this. Is there any response to God by the Israelites? Zero. No thankfulness. No turning to the Lord. The Lord is a tool for their own purposes. That's how they're viewing him. And in the midst of all of this provision, they do not turn to the Lord. And that's why it says here that ultimately his anger was kindled and he struck them down with a great plague because they rejected him. In fact, the language that we find there in the Hebrew kind of brings it out, that the quail was rejected out of their nostrils just like they rejected the Lord. It's a beautiful little word picture. Or an ugly word picture. But either way, it's fascinating to see. And so what actually happened? Was this just providential, that they did not properly preserve the meat, and so then they had this plague that ultimately came from eating spoiled meat, and they died, and that those who were turning to the Lord and were more reasonable in their approach lived? It could be. But regardless, the Lord punished them and called the name of the place, literally, the graves of craving. What do we take from that? We take that idea. Their desires were in the wrong spot. And that is often the problem with complaints, isn't it? That with complaint, my desire is in the wrong spot. If my desire is with what the Lord wants me to desire, then it is his delight to give it to me. Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 17 through 19. A great-great-grandchild of these folks responded in the same manner as Moses. In the midst of complaints, a lament, he went to the Lord. And then in verse 17 through 19, he says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. You say, that sounds like a complaint. I'd say it is. He's speaking the truth. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. There's the other side. He's speaking the truth. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. He's speaking the truth. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. Man, that's the right response. So in Numbers, as the journey begins, the character of the people is revealed, and God makes it clear that he has no room for complaining. Lament? Yes. Turning to him? 100%. Complaints? Reveal something else. Hey, as we try to put application into our own life, can I just encourage you to think deeply about what this passage is saying about how you respond and live? What is your complaint revealing? How is your complaint lying? Where is your complaint looking? If we pause and ask these questions when we are tempted to complain, I think it will do us a world of good.